Okay, good morning everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Today I would like to share with you a study on coming out stories. This case study is part of a larger project that I did for my master's thesis. And it was not included because it kind of took on its own momentum. So in the presentation we will see how coming out narratives can be shaped by this interactional dynamics in a research interview between a Greek-American interviewee and an Asian interviewer. And surprise, I was that Asian interviewer. Who else? But before we get started, let's maybe take a moment, 5 seconds, to think about this question. What is coming out? This is a question that I ask all of my study participants in the beginning of the interviews. So feel free to share with us your thoughts. Tweet about it, tagging me, DC 2015, and using the hashtag CLASP 2017 to join the online discussion. And maybe we can, review some of your responses during the panel discussion. So this is the quote that I personally really like. So Rust suggests that we should reconceptualize coming out as an ongoing dynamic process of describing one's social location within a changing social context. So you see, coming from Taiwan, I've always thought that coming out means telling people, hey, I'm gay. But after I came here, people have been telling me, well, you have to first come out to yourself before coming out to others. And that coming out to self versus coming out to others had never occurred to me before. So in this case, we can say that when I came out, I'm describing my social location as a gay man in a heterosexual world. When I moved from Taiwan to the United States, I am also relocating and describing myself in the social context and fitting myself in the coming out discourse in the US. And for my participants, it's more of a matter of describing his role as an interviewee in the context of the research interview. So these are some of the key concepts that we might want to keep in mind as we delve deeper into the data, the social location, and the social context. And there are a few issues we might want to address first. So why narratives? Well, coming out narratives have been used as mainly a methodology in the past to collect data, to develop models, especially in the field of psychology, but rarely has it been studied closely by looking at how storytellers present themselves or position themselves in relation to the story recipients, especially the interaction in which the stories are embedded. So what I'm suggesting here is that we can take a linguistic perspective and look more closely, like turn by turn, line by line, how the stories unfold. For example, Lindy, studying life stories, suggests that narrative is a significant resource for creating our sense of self and conveying that self to and negotiating that self with others. Building on that, Schifrin argues that narrative is a means for us to verbalize and situate our experience as text, both locally and globally, and it provides a resource for the representation of personal and social identity. So when we are telling a story, we're making past events relevant to the here and now and to a particular audience. And that leads us to the second point. There has been this debate arguing, narratives in a naturally occurring conversations are more natural, whereas interview data is more artificial. In response to that, Fina points out that narratives elicited in interviews are not told without social objectives, but that the interactional rules and social relationships involved are different. So when someone, for example, a participant tells a story in a research interview, there are also interaction interaction rules that we might want to take into consideration. And later, the Fina and Perrino explained that interactional interview is a legitimate interactional encounter, and that's the view that I'm going to take when I approach my data. Lastly, my study is a direct response to this finding, Liang's study back in 1997, when she looked at a group of college students in a coming out story session where they shared their coming out experiences. She found that while European Americans recount their desperation and the measures they took to try to be straight or produce detailed descriptions of their attempts at denial, Asian Americans tend not to mention any desire to be heterosexual, nor do they dwell on inner struggles. To conclude, she writes that the fact that Asian American stories do not reveal the inner conflict to the same extent as those told by European Americans can be attributed to adherence to the value of Asian culture, that is, maintaining social harmony. This is something that really lent me some insight and something that I incorporated into my study, because in addition to the distinction between coming out to others and coming out to self that I mentioned earlier, this component of inner struggle in one's coming out story becomes salient when I was analyzing the data. So without further ado, let's jump right into the stories. So in excerpt 1, again, as you can see, I started the interview by asking, how do we define a coming out story? But I preface my question by saying in line 1 and 2, my study focuses on coming out story, especially those set in a cross-cultural context. And as you can see in just a minute, how that has a huge influence on how my participants answer my questions. And in line 10 and 11, the participant Alex, pseudonym, responded everything. But as far as the most important one to ask is coming out to yourself. And this is where he first mentioned this really crucial and integral component of coming out stories in the interview. And it is also where it kind of diverges from my understanding of what a coming out story looks like. So when I asked him, so let's talk about the first time coming out experience, I was expecting him to tell me something like, oh, I came out to my friend, telling people that he's gay. Instead, in line 2, we can see that, well, first time it was when I came out to myself, and then he goes on to describe the social context. So for example, in line 7, you can see he says, our culture is definitely distinct from Greek culture in Greece. It's more shaped by the Greek Orthodox Church. And lastly, the church is really the only institution that held our culture together. So going back to the quote earlier, he is describing himself as a gay man in the social context of growing up in a Greek American culture. And then he goes on to say that exact moment where he came out to himself. So in line 14, you can see this is the beginning of like a traditional, typical Lovovian narrative where there is time, place, orientation. I just remember one night, when I was in a town for a job interview, I was in bed and I was just thinking, wait a minute, all these thoughts I'm having, could I be gay? And then my eyes just opened, this makes a lot of sense. It was shocking, but it was also liberating. And lastly, he said, where I was really tormented myself because I hadn't told anyone yet. So this is something that was really unfamiliar to me, and I didn't really pick up this part of his coming out stories. And later, I keep pressing on, tell me more about your experience coming out to others. But later when I come back and revisit this part of the story, I realized, oh, so this is a really important part for him, for the participant. And also, you can see not only the coming out to self component in his coming out story, that in a struggle, as you can see in line 21, is also can also be observed here. And a few lines down, he comes back to that moment where he came out to himself by saying, I was just lying in bed thinking about things, but it just hit me, all these thoughts I'm having, the fact that I do get aroused by guys, and then in line 40, it goes on to say, I was expected to be interested in girls, but I just couldn't make it happen. And then I realized being attracted to guys is not just a phase. So again, going back to that quote, here he is, again, describing his social location within the broader social context in which, as a cisgender male, he is expected and assumed to like women. So, as part of his coming out stories, he is defining that for his coming out. And then in this part, we will see how as he is narrating his past experience, and along that process, he's also making sense and even creating a sense of self while he's doing that. So in line 1, I asked the question. I thought it might have something to do with this realization. So following right after this story of coming out to self, I was suggesting whether there is this connection between his coming out to self happening right before a job interview. And in line 2, he said, well, indirectly, after I came out, I realized the field was wrong for me. I was in engineering, which was, very social, closed-off field. And then in the following part, he describes how he made the transition from engineering to marketing and then to sales. And then he told me I could be myself in terms of personality now that he has found himself in a new market or a new workplace. Not just in terms of sexuality, but personality. I could just be open and not conform to gender stereotype, The male has to be really macho and very tough. I could just be myself. If I want to raise my voice, I could, like I'm doing now. And then, toward the end, like line 33 and 34, you can see, so I think it's, in a way, I'm glad you asked it, because it is related, it's very much related. So you can see that shift from initially, he said, well, indirectly related, to this point where he's kind of accepted the connection that I was suggesting, and say that it is related, it is very much related. So you can see, by telling a story in this social context, that interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee is very real. And then in this part, we will see how Alex demonstrates a more overt awareness of his coming out story and how that fits into my research topic. So after he told me how he came out to his parents, he says, my sister is American born like I am, so that's not as big a part of our culture for us. It's funny you mentioned that the title is coming out in a cross-cultural context, because as a first generation in America, my life is a cross-cultural context, I have my Greek cultural background, but I was born in Washington, D.C. I went to American public schools, I went to an American private university, and he goes on to say, my life is a cross-cultural context, and I did come out in a cross-cultural context, so he showed that he was fully aware of my expectation of a coming out story, and reframed his coming out story to fit in my expectation. And lastly, he it's also another shift from coming out to self to coming out to others, and also this awareness of the cultural aspect of my study. He gave me a story in which he came out to someone who's from another culture. So this happened at his work. He says, another gentleman who's also from another culture asked me, when are we getting married? And my natural response was, when I meet the right guy. And then in line 7 you can see, but the other gentleman, he was shocked for 2 days. I can just tell. And then jump to line 10. Finally, in the end, I told him, he said, oh, how can you know 2 men be married? I just said to him, look, you know, it's 2015. Marriage equality has been legal in the United States since June. So this, in this part, is describing his social location in the newly reformed United States legal system in which same-sex marriage is legal. And that's how, again, he came out to himself and also how he described to me. So in conclusion, coming out narratives can be examined closely using discourse analysis. We can see how the storyteller changed that understanding of coming out story line by line, turn by turn. And also cultural differences must be approached with discretion. There might be cultural patterns that we see, but we might also want to be careful with our methodology analysis. And last but not least, contextual factors and interactional dynamics are real in research interviews, just as they are real in naturally occurring conversations. And when we're dealing with interview data, these are the things that we should account for. Thank you very much. And the slide on LinkedIn, ResearchGate, Academia, or if you have any questions or suggestions, email.
Thank you, Ping-Hsuan. Okay, next from the University of California, Los Angeles,